All right, this evaluation is going to be about your study methods. I titled it How Effective is Your Study? That's going to be kind of the overall takeaway that you get once you finished it. But where you're starting off here is just how much time you're spending studying using different methods. And in the study section of the course, I'm going to speak in more detail about how I like to use each of these methods of study, the way that I think you can get the most out of it, pushing towards the end goal of being more effective in your study. But right now, at the beginning of this evaluation, all you're trying to do is get a breakdown of like, where am I devoting my resources right now? So if there's some total amount of study time, and maybe you haven't considered all of this stuff as study, but I would call all of this study. What is the distribution of all these different methods? Maybe some you don't use at all, some you use all the time, just so we get an idea of how your time is being spent. So the way that I distribute my study time right now, I basically never watch content. I wouldn't say never used, but I watch a pretty small amount of content. Let's say hand discussion is also pretty limited, although I'll mark it as used occasionally because during a series, I'll talk a good number of hands with people who are just in my circle at the time, people I'm either interacting with or swapping with or just at the event with. Memorizing preflop charts. This is something I work pretty often on. I wouldn't say consistent routine, but for tournaments, this is a big part of my study. Playing versus GTO trainers. I would say this is similar. I like to use GTO trainers for preflop personally more than I use them for postflop, although I will use them occasionally for postflop, more for my coaching work than for my own study. I'm still going to give that a 4. And browsing pre-solved databases. So this would be like your analytical study of individual spots. I would say I use this less than I use the trainers for sure. And here, I'm thinking of this as a separate, more of a post-flop thing compared to the memorizing pre-flop charts, which is kind of the same thing, like pre-solved database of pre-flop charts, pre-solved database of post-flop solutions, I suppose. Database analysis, this is something I do a lot, both for myself and for my students. I'm going to mark that as a 5. And this, if it's unclear to you at this point in time what a consistent routine of database analysis would look like, I have a number of videos later in the course about how I use database analysis and what my methods would be in that area. So certainly don't worry if this is not clear to you right now. It should hopefully, all of these methods of study hopefully should be a lot more clear by the time you've completed the second section of this course. So running custom sims, I'm labeling this as separate from browsing pre-solved databases. The benefits of running your own sims compared to pre-solves, again, are laid out later in the course, but I think this is a more advanced area to be in. So if you haven't seen the other evaluations, this is fundamental, intermediate, advanced. The more advanced stuff, I think, should be tackled only after you feel more comfortable with the fundamental and then the intermediate material. So I would say I do less custom sim work than I used to. I'll give myself a 3 here. And working with a coach, I do work with a mental game coach. I don't work with a technical coach. I'm thinking from a technical point of view as I'm doing this review. I think you could label it either way. I'm going to give myself a 2 here. I actually think that working with a technical coach more frequently than I do would be beneficial for me. So that's this next question here. Are there any study methods you'd like to use more often? It's not really about, getting all of these to a 5. That's not the goal for this section. You you wouldn't really be able to have a consistent routine of all these different study methods. It's just about, what's the right study method for you right now? What are your current goals? And that's what all these evaluations combined should help you figure out. And then figuring out which study method lines up with those goals. But what are the methods that I personally would like to use more often? I think custom sims and working with a coach are methods that I would benefit from personally and have not used significantly in the recent past. These other ones, content and hand history discussion, I'm not really looking to do more of this than I currently am. The stuff that I'm doing a lot of, I could probably spend less time doing some of these things because I've devoted so much of my study to them previously. So that's kind of the point of this part of the evaluation, is seeing where most of your time is going and then considering if you'd like to redistribute that time. Now, with the same methods, I want you to think about your learning style. So how useful do you find these study methods? And maybe this will help clarify, whether or not you should be using more or less of your time there. So for me, I think that this is a relatively low impact. I'm not going to give it a 1. I think there's stuff that I gather from watching content, but it's not the most useful. Hand history discussion I find very useful. It's not my top preferred method, but I do find it very useful. Memorizing preflop charts I also at the moment am finding quite useful. Playing versus trainers I think is like maybe my top preferred method for routine situations anyways. And browsing pre-solved databases, I do find this somewhat useful. I've kind of gotten to the point where my pattern recognition is just, I don't know, drawing the same conclusions that I would get from looking up a lot of spots, although every now and then I'll run into spots where this is actually quite useful. So I'll give that a 3. It's somewhat useful. Database analysis I always find useful. It is my preferred method for the way that I like to learn the game. And again, this isn't about like what's the highest impact necessarily for you. It's literally just when you have tried doing this stuff, how has that worked out for you? Do you think it's engaging? Do you think it's beneficial? Do you like it? Running custom sims, I do find this beneficial, probably more than browsing. It's still not my top preferred method, but I do find it more useful than browsing. And I'm actually going to give that 2. And working with a coach is something I find really beneficial, probably similarly beneficial to hand history discussion. And that's just because I'm fortunate enough to be surrounded by a lot of really intelligent people to talk hands with, and it feels very much like a coaching environment when I do talk hands with them. So I'm going to rate that kind of similarly. So in the areas that I've rated myself below a 3, I've asked you to not necessarily like explain why you're rated poorly here, but just think, is this something you want to work on? Is this a learning style that you wish you could get more out of, or that you feel the obligation to improve at, because you can improve at different study methods? For these, watching poker content, browsing pre-solved databases, not necessarily learning styles that I aspire to use more often. I do think that I could spend more time watching poker content, and I think that I could engage more with that content to improve my game, because I have kind of written it off for a long enough period of time that I sometimes feel a little bit out of touch with, like, I don't want to call it the current meta, but maybe the current state of poker conversation. And this is actually something that helped me a lot when I was coming up, learning the game using the 2+2 forums. So I think that's the area that I would label for myself that I could improve my utilization of that study method. And that's all we're trying to do, is identify the areas that you would like to spend more time. Now, learning specificity. So this, I'm now asking you to consider how useful these methods really are for you. And I'm challenging you a bit to identify why it is that we use this method of content, or this method of study. So I go over this in the study section with each of these methods. I would like you at least once to try doing this without going through and watching that, because I don't necessarily want you to feel like I've given you the answers to these questions. I don't really think it's going to work that way, but just to be safe, I think it's a little more challenging. I think it's a little more engaging if you fill out this section now, and you're really just trying to rate yourself on, like, why am I using this? What is the purpose of watching poker content, right? Do I know what I'm working on with this method of study? If I was to rate these for the average person, if I was to, sort of put myself in the shoes of one of my typical students and say, how useful are all of these methods of study? Not to say that this is their limit. I think they can all be 5s. But I would say the typical person is getting pretty small amount from content. Maybe hand history discussion is helping, but it's not helping as much as it could. I think that memorizing preflop charts is pretty clear. This is, if you're doing a good job with this, you're addressing a very necessary issue. I think playing GTO trainers, again, is very clear. You're trying to get better theoretically in the situations that you're training. So, this is pretty much, do you know the purpose of this method, right? I think people really struggle with the pre-solved database stuff. I'm going to give the average person a 2 here. I think database analysis is pretty tricky as well. A little more clear, like you're just trying to improve your stats, but a lot of people don't know what they're trying to improve necessarily. And then same thing with running custom sims. I think this is similar to pre-solved databases. It's just very hard to figure out what it is we're trying to address when we go through these methods. So hopefully, through the study section of the course, I clarify not only the methods that are needed here, but also the kind of strengths, the particular strengths of these methods of study, and what they can help you with. Working with a coach, I think, is more directed by the coach than it is by the student. But to some extent, the student needs to know what they're trying to fix, and the coach doesn't always know that, or they're not always strong at doing this. So I'll give this a 4 for the average person. So this is like a rough rating of how specific I would say the average player, or the average player I've come across, is in what they're doing with these. And that's actually why I push trainers and preflop study so hard to a lot of my students, is that I think it's just very impactful compared to other study methods, even if you don't have a lot of expertise in what it is exactly you're trying to do. So down here below, you would, fill out what are the most effective ways that you personally are able to study. Maybe it's GTO trainers. And for me, it might be database analysis. For you, it might be hand history discussion. And what are your least effective study methods? So maybe this is, sims, pre-solves in this area. And also watching poker content. I mean, this, for a lot of people, I think falls under the category of entertainment, although I will cover in that video how you can turn it into effective study. And right here is just kind of your quick summary at the bottom. Any study methods you plan to use more often, how it's going to make your study more effective. This is just like your wrap-up sentence here, explaining what it is you're trying to accomplish or change based on the information that you just filled out through here. So hopefully that helps clarify how it is you're going about studying and what you'd like to change about that routine.